you did?
Yeah.
So,
Welcome back to Global Media Network. Passionate World Talk Radio is a wholly owned subsidiary of GMN LLC. Our motto is educate, enlighten, and entertain. And this afternoon on Lest We Forget, hosts Lisa Skinner, Betsy Wurzel, and I, Lillian Cauldwell, will continue the discussion of human trafficking, and this will be the end of this particular topic. Next week, we have a special program coming in, so it won't be until August 18th that we will be starting a new topic. So good afternoon, and Lisa will begin.
hi, everybody. Thanks for being back with us for another episode of Lest We Forget -historical. We are talking about slavery and how it has evolved into human trafficking, which is just an absolute prevalent business, making billions and billions of dollars today. So I started off the show last week giving you a history of slavery in the US and actually shared some very intriguing information about how that whole thing evolved. And as promised, today I'm going to pick up where I left off last week at the end of the Civil War, when the slaves were freed and what life was like for them after the Civil War. So if we all fall back to our history books, we know that the 13th Amendment ended slavery in 1865 officially. And slavery's end meant newfound freedom for African Americans, or did it? During the period, the Black family, the Black church, and education were central elements in the lives of post-emancipation African Americans. Many African Americans lived in desperate rural poverty across the South in the decades that followed the Civil War. For African Americans in the South, life after slavery was a world transformed. Gone were the brutalities and indignities of slave life that we talked about last week, the whippings, the sexual assaults, the selling and forcible relocation of family members, the denial of education, wages, legal marriage, home ownership, and more. African Americans celebrated their newfound freedom, both privately and in public jubilees. But life in the years after slavery also proved to be extremely difficult. Although slavery was legally over, the brutalities of white race prejudice persisted. After slavery, state governments across the South instituted laws called the Black Codes. These laws granted certain legal rights to Blacks, including now they have the right to marry, the right to own property, the right to sue in court. But the codes also made it illegal for Blacks to serve on juries, to testify against whites, or to serve in state militias. The Black Codes also required Black sharecroppers and tenant farmers to sign annual labor contracts with white landowners. If they refused, they could be arrested and hired out for work. So really what they're doing is finding another way to keep them enslaved. Most Southern Black Americans, although they were free, lived in desperate rural poverty, as I said before. Having been denied education and wages under slavery, Ex-slaves were often forced by the necessity of their economic circumstances to rent land from former white slave owners. These sharecroppers paid rent on the land by giving a portion of their crop to the landowner. So I want to ask the state of Florida, how did they possibly learn and benefit from any skills that you're trying to emphasize in the school system? Because this sure doesn't sound to me like they benefited from any skills that they learned while enslaved. In a few places in the South, former slaves seized land from former slave owners in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War, but federal troops quickly restored the land to the white landowners. A movement among Republicans in Congress to provide land to former slaves was unsuccessful. Former slaves were never compensated for their enslavement. When slavery was abolished at the end of the Civil War, Southern states created these Black codes, laws which aimed to keep white supremacy in place. Black codes attempted to economically disable freed slaves, forcing African Americans to continue to work on plantations and to remain subject to racial hierarchy within the Southern society. Black codes also gave rise to a new wave of radical republicanism in Congress and the eventual move towards enshrining racial equality into the Constitution. However, Black codes also set precedent for Jim Crow laws. Judges bound many African American orphans to white plantation owners who would then force them to work. Adult freedmen were forced to sign contracts with their employers, who were oftentimes their previous owners. These contracts prevented African Americans from working for more than one employer, and therefore from positively influencing the very low wages or poor working conditions that they were subjected to. Any former slaves that attempted to violate or evade these contracts were fined, beaten, or arrested for vagrancy. Upon arrest, many free African Americans were made to work for no wages, essentially being reduced to the very definition of a slave. Although slavery had been outlawed by the 13th Amendment, it effectively continued in many Southern states. They just found another way to work around it. The 11 Southern states that had decided to leave the Union in 1880 the 11 Southern states, I can't see worth the darn when the print's small, so I needed my glasses. The 11 Southern states that had decided to leave the Union in 1860 and 1861 were basket cases by 1865. Only Texas, where there hadn't been much fighting, was in relatively decent shape. Southern cities such as Atlanta, Charleston, South Carolina, and Richmond were left in ruins. Few businesses of any kind were still operating. Little capital was available to start new businesses, and few outsiders were willing to risk investing in the area. For example, 7,000 miles of railroad track were laid in the South between 1865 and 1879. In the rest of the country, 45,000 miles were laid. So 45 compared to 7. Before the war, the South's economy had been based almost strictly on agriculture. We talked about that last week. Mainly cotton, tobacco, and sugar. And all these industries suffered, especially cotton. Southern cotton production in 1870 was half of what it was at the beginning of the Civil War in 1860. The education system in the South had virtually disappeared, along with the old plantation system. More than 250,000 of the South's young men were gone too. Pretty much the whole of life has been merely not dying, wrote the Southern poet Sidney Lanier about the Reconstruction period. Two post-war changes dominated Southern life. One was the bewildering new world faced by the freed slaves. The other was a new farming practice known as sharecropping that would ultimately make life more difficult for both ex-slaves and poor whites. For more than 3 million African Americans, the whole of life post-Civil War had become pretty darn confusing for everyone. They had their freedom, but didn't know what they should do with it. And few former slaves had any education or training. Some thought freedom meant freedom from work. Others were fearful that to continue working for white people would put them in danger of being enslaved again. And many believed a widespread rumor that the federal government would be giving each slave 40 acres and a mule to start their own farms. But such a plan never existed. But in 1865, the federal government did organize the Freedmen's Bureau that I mentioned earlier, which was an agency designed to help freed slaves during their transition from slavery to freedom by providing them with food, education, and other support. So from 1865 to 1868, the Bureau helped as many as 200,000 former slaves learn to read. About 10,000 Black families were settled by this Bureau on land that had been confiscated by Union troops, although most of them were eventually forced off the land by whites who swindled them out of it or used dubious legal methods. Big surprise, right?
Right.
Didn't we hear this before with the Native Americans?
Yeah.
Most Blacks and many whites could not afford to buy their own land, so a new form of farming became the basis for the Southern agricultural economy. Again, they called it sharecropping. Under this sharecropping, the farmer farmed land owned by someone else, and the two shared the profits. You think it really worked out that way?
No.
Hold on. This was the ideal, but in most cases, the sharecropper, the freed slaves, had to borrow money to make ends meet until their next crop was harvested. This borrowing left them with so little when the crop was harvested that they had to borrow against their next crop. Thus, many sharecroppers, both Black and the poor whites, became virtual slaves to debt. You've heard of the company stores, right?
Yeah.
Lillian, you can tell us about the company stores. What were they in this period, this Reconstruction period?
Yeah. They have songs about them. The folk song, I owe my soul to the company store.
That's
and
right.
Basically, they literally did that. They were kept enslaved, or they were serfs.
They had these stores where they jacked up the prices.
Yes.
And then had them sign for the price of the goods and tacked on interest.
And the food, canned food, yes.
Yeah, and the debt kept growing and growing and growing to make it impossible for them to
leave.
Ever. Yeah.
Yes.
So they just found a workaround for the original definition of slavery.
Slavery, yeah.
The sharecropping system dominated many parts of the South, replacing the plantation system. In 1868, perhaps 1/3 of the area's farms were tended by renters. By 1900, that percentage grew to about 70%. So it went from 1/3 to 70%. The system, coupled with low cotton prices and the ravages of an insect pest called the boll weevil, virtually guaranteed that few farmers could ever become successful, no matter how hard they worked. So, this is actually how slavery survived in the South long after the Civil War. Slavery might have legally ended on paper after the Civil War, but many white landowners did everything they could to exploit newly freed slaves well into the 20th century. Thousands of Black laborers across the South were forced to work against their will. And this one man talked about his family and how they were held on a plantation against their will in the 1950s. It explained how they used decades-old records to uncover how slavery was actually perpetuated long after the Civil War ended. So during this period of Reconstruction, from 1865 to 1877, Congress passed and enforced laws that promoted civil and political rights for African Americans across the South. Most notable among the laws Congress passed were 3 amendments to the U.S. Constitution. The 13th in 1865, that was the amendment that officially ended slavery. Then the 14th Amendment in 1868 guaranteed African Americans the rights of American citizenship. And then finally, the 15th Amendment in 1870 guaranteed Black men the constitutional right to vote. African Americans actively took up these rights, opportunities, and responsibilities of becoming full-fledged citizens. During Reconstruction, 700 African American men served in elected public office, among them 2 United States senators and 14 members of the United States House of Representatives. Another 1,300 African American men and women held appointed government jobs. After 1867, an increasing number of Southern whites turned to violence in response to the revolutionary changes of this radical Reconstruction era. The Ku Klux Klan and other white supremacist organizations targeted local Republican leaders, white and Black, and other African Americans who challenged white authority. Though federal legislation passed during the administration of President Ulysses S. Grant in 1871 took aim at the Klan and others who attempted to interfere with Black suffrage and other political rights. But white supremacy gradually reasserted its hold on the South, and after the early 1870s, as support for Reconstruction waned. Racism was still a potent force in both South and the North, and Republicans became more conservative and less egalitarian as the decade continued. In 1874, an economic depression plunged much of the South into more poverty. The Democratic Party won control of the House of Representatives for the first time since the Civil War. And then the Compromise of 1876 actually marked the end of Reconstruction as a district period, but the struggle to deal with the revolution ushered in by slavery's eradication would continue in the South and elsewhere long after that date. An entire century later, the legacy of Reconstruction would be revived during the civil rights movement of the 1960s, as African Americans fought for the political, economic, and social equality that they had long been denied. When Reconstruction ended in 1877, the freed people had seen little improvement in their economic and social status. This set the foundation for the racially discriminatory Jim Crow segregation policies that impoverished generations of African Americans. So, Blacks weren't allowed in eateries where white people attended. Schools were segregated. You couldn't ride on the same buses. This was in my lifetime. In 1866, a very famous Confederate general, his name was Nathan Bedford Forrest, perhaps you've heard of him. He actually was the founder of the Ku Klux Klan in Tennessee, but it was initially organized as a social club. And we know from history of the Civil War that he did not like slaves. He did not like the Black race. That was made very clear. So he actually is the one that initially organized the Ku Klux Klan. The name was supposedly derived from the Greek words kaiklos, meaning circle. The Klan was not maintained by a centralized national organization, but instead operated as a network of local terrorist groups. The Klan referred to themselves as the Invisible Empire of the South, spearheading an underground movement against republicanism and Reconstruction in the hopes of maintaining white supremacy in the post-war South. Now, the Klan evolved and committed acts of violence, primarily undercover, literally, wearing the disguise of a long flowing white robe and hood capped by horns. They sometimes claimed to be the ghosts of the Confederate soldiers. And then the Klan also worked to restrict Black economic empowerment. Any white people who encouraged Black economic autonomy, like merchants who purchased cotton from Black farmers, were threatened, beaten, and even killed. The Klan disassembled African American and Republican community organizing initiatives by terrorizing Black churches, as well as many schools established by the Freedmen's Bureau. Finally, the Klan maintained its control since many witnesses were terrified to testify against a Klansman, fearing violent reprisal. In response, Congress passed the Force Acts of 1870, which required the South to fully recognize the guarantee of equal protection stipulated by the 14th Amendment. Since the Force Acts inadequately addressed persistent violence, Congress passed the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871 soon thereafter. The Ku Klux Klan Act was the first piece of U.S. legislation that made individuals and states punishable under a federal law for hate crimes or disenfranchising citizens on the basis of race. What happened to it?
Yeah, I haven't seen it.
President Ulysses S. Grant used the act to challenge Klan activity, which was most prevalent in South Carolina. Interesting. South Carolina started the Civil War.
They're the first to secede.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yet as Reconstruction came to a close, so did counter-Klan measures. White supremacists gradually reasserted control over the South as the system of Jim Crow segregation took hold. The Klan would experience a huge resurgence in the 1920s with the nativist movement, and another uprising in the 1950s following Brown versus the Board of Education. At its height in the mid-1920s, the KKK, Ku Klux Klan, had 4 million members nationwide dedicated to intimidating, torturing, and killing African Americans and allied activists. And guess what? The Ku Klux Klan still exists today.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. They come out of the surface right with the fascists. Two go hand in hand.
So it doesn't sound like life for the freed slaves was a cakewalk for anybody, even though it was legally absolved by the 13th Amendment. So Lillian, you'll pick it up from here and continue with
here.
modern day slavery.
Modern day slavery, AKA, is human trafficking. And I am taking a different way of addressing it today. I'm going to give you a case study that I found, and Betsy has the resource in which I found it, and it was written by a doctor who was involved with it as well. So this is fact supported by fact. Basically, she rescued a young lady from a trafficking gang. It was in her neighborhood, right under everybody's faces. And she saved her from being beaten by some gentleman, although he really wasn't a gentleman. He was a pimp, a pervert, who was facing charges criminally for doing the same thing to somebody else in another state. However, she got the young lady away from this gentleman. And since she needed help, drugs were used on her. She was raped. She was sold for sexual gain. And we're talking about a kid, ladies and gentlemen. You're not recognized as an adult until you're 18, right? So anything under 18 and someone has sex with you, that is considered rape, whether it's your father or your mother or the next door neighbor. You're still a child under the law of 18. And she tried to take the young lady to several places. She noticed that not only was she dealing with domestic abuse, but she was also dealing with the no self-esteem of the child. And she found that when she could not get her into a place to put an underage child, she was put in various places like a mental health facility, put into a hotel, which was paid for by an organization against human trafficking. And a lot of times she landed up in homeless shelters. And you're shrugging your shoulders saying, so, well, that's what goes. I mean, look at the poor. Well, I am. And the fact of the matter was that this young lady was scarred for life. Not only did she have post-traumatic stress syndrome, but she also had health issues to the point where, yes, if she had a baby at 13, it will certainly affect how she's going to be when she becomes emotionally and physically ready to give birth. It's very rare in the United States for 12 and 13-year-old girls to give birth. And there's a reason for it, because you're not ready to have the responsibility. And also your body isn't fully developed. I mean, when I was a grown woman, there was a woman in the bed next to me, and they had to give her a pediatromy. What was that? They had to make a slit in her vagina to allow the child to come out. Otherwise, it would have torn the lower half of her vagina. So imagine you're 12 or 13 years old, and you've gotten pregnant by who knows who, and the kid is bigger than your vagina to allow that child to be born. They're not going to have an episiotomy. It's going to rip. They're not going to get regular medical help from a nurse practitioner or from a doctor to sew them up properly. They're just going to leave it. And if they're lucky, they may even staunch the blood. There's no guarantee. And this is happening to a 12-year-old kid. And please don't tell me that Romeo and Julia fell in love were 14, because one has nothing to do with the other. Romeo and Juliet were in medieval times, and by the time you were 20, 21, you were pretty much dead. Very unusual to hit your 30s or your 40s. So by the time you were 14, you were considered physically an adult. But this is the 21st century, and 12 and 13-year-old girls in today's real world are not physically ready to give birth. Yes. One of the things she found was that a lot of these young women, not knowing anything else, go right back to what they were. And this is exactly what happened with this young lady who she rescued. She went back to the original guy. And guess what happened to him? Nothing. His hands were slapped. He went to prison, what, for 3 or 4 months? And that was it. For ruining a life of a 14-year-old girl. Because not only had she the emotional trauma that's going to follow her, but her body may never recover from what happened from the beatings, from the repeated rape, from going to bed with every Tom, Dick, and Harry, or Louise. See, the thing of the matter is, we're also talking about VD. These kids are not given condoms. They are not given anything to prevent these diseases getting into their system. And most of these diseases, well, they sterilize you if you don't catch them. So I decided, after telling that nice, pleasant little story, I came across a government website that offers 21 ideas to consider to battle against human trafficking. And that is my call, and Betsy Wurzel's call, and Lisa Skinner's call to action. So instead of shrugging your shoulders and saying, what do you expect me to do about it? I'm just one person. Nobody's going to listen to me. Well, just recall what our then president did to incite a riot on the Capitol building, and how his words stirred up a mob of people. Oh, and if that makes you uncomfortable, fine, we'll go back to the French Revolution. How words from one person mobilized a force of maybe 4,000 to 5,000 peasants who stormed the Versailles, captured the king, queen, and their children, and then beheaded them. So these are the ideas. If you do any of these, please let us know. DM us, text us, 484-364-1032, and say, this is what I did to stop this in my neighborhood, because it could have been my 14-year-old daughter or my 12-year-old son. Learn the indicators of human trafficking on the TIP office's website. But this is the important point. Take training. Human traffic awareness training is available for individuals, businesses, first responders, law enforcement, educators, and federal employees. Ask your CPA or PPO to bring it to your school. Yes, bring it to your high school, discuss it in college, have a guest speaker at your corporation, have some of the organizations outside of business bring in a speaker, because it could be your kid or your niece or your nephew or somebody you met at the country club. Human traffickers don't care if the kid comes from a multi-billionaire neighborhood. They don't ask them how much their father or mother is making. Number two, if you're in the United States and believe someone may be a victim of human trafficking, call the 24-hour National Human Trafficker hotline at 1-888-373-7888, or report an emergency to law enforcement by calling 911. Trafficking victims, whether they're U.S. citizens or not, are eligible for services and immigration assistance. I didn't know that. That's very important. Even if you're not an American citizen, you'll still get somebody to come and help you should you be a victim of human trafficking, but you catch it before it actually happens. 3, be conscientious and informed consumer. Find out more who have picked up your tomatoes or made your clothes at responsiblesourcing2.org, or check out the Department of Labor's list of goods produced by child labor or forced labor. You know why all the companies in the United States transferred their business overseas to the Far East? Because it was cheaper. Because a lot of these countries use children to work in their factories. And if they lose an arm or a leg or a toe, so that's fine. There are plenty of kids out in the street that they can bring in. I mean, the United States used to do that when the Industrial Revolution first came in. Who do you think were in all those mills that spun the cotton? Think about it. Encourage companies to take steps to prevent human trafficking in their supply chains and publish the information, including supplier or factory lists, for consumer awareness. You know what Castro did during the 80s? He would invite kids, wealthy kids from the United States, to come down to Cuba and cut sugarcane for the summer. And you know what? They went down, not realizing that they were being used as, well, propaganda, yes, but they were being treated as slaves while they were down there. They couldn't leave the property. They had to stay where they were, and they had no protection from the overseers down there who checked up on their work. Now, I already can hear somebody say, oh, well, that's not going to happen to me. Really? Who do you think picks our crops during the season? The immigrants don't do it anymore. They've smartened up. They take kids off the street, or they're used from human trafficking gangs, and they're forced to go into fields and pick our crops. Think about it. Next time you have some tomatoes or maybe some watermelon. Number 4, volunteer and support anti-trafficking efforts in your community. 5, meet with or write to your local state and federal elected officials to let them know you care about combating human trafficking and ask what they're going to do to address it. It's a big deal. Washington, D.C. knows all about it, but with all those old men in there, do you think they really give a good... Never mind. You can fill in the blanks without me filling them in for you. Everybody's aware of human trafficking, and yet no one does anything about it. I guess it's kind of like women's rights. They didn't really want to give it to us, but we marched and we protested, and yes, we threw some really regal public temper tantrums, and we finally got it. And maybe that's what we need to do about human trafficking. Be well informed. Set up a web alert to receive current human trafficking news. Check out CNN's Freedom Project for more stories on the different forms of human trafficking around the world. Yes, we network with a lot of other human traffickers all over the world. Aren't you proud of the United States? Come on. This is just like President Roosevelt, except he didn't help the Jews now, did he? Okay. Host an awareness raising event to watch and discuss films about human trafficking. For example, learn how modern slavery exists today. Watch an investigative documentary about sex trafficking or discover how forced labor can affect global food supply chains. Outside of climate change, we got to watch out for that, folks. Without forced labor, you may not be able to have fresh corn when you have your hamburger tonight. Alternately, contact your local library and ask for assistance identifying an appropriate book and ask them to host the event. Oh, yeah, that means you actually have to expose yourself for what you are, a concerned citizen. Can't have that now, can we? Organize a fundraiser and donate the proceeds to an anti-trafficking organization. Encourage your local schools or school districts to include human trafficking in their curriculum and to develop protocols for identifying and reporting a suspected case of human trafficking or responding to a potential victim. Use your social media platforms to raise awareness about human trafficking using the following hashtags. Hashtag end trafficking. Hashtag freedom first. Think about whether your workplace is trauma informed and reach out to management or the human resources team to urge implementation of trauma informed business practices. Become a mentor to a young person or someone in need. Traffickers often target people who are going through a difficult time or who lack strong support systems. As a mentor, you can be involved in new and positive experiences in that person's life during a formative time, i.e. teenagers. And young kids, they find that if you get a child as young as first or second grade and start teaching them karate, they're deadly by the time they're 4 or 5 years old because they take it very seriously. To them, it's not a game. They're learning how to protect themselves or their mommy or their daddy or their siblings. Parents and caregivers, learn how human traffickers often target and recruit youth and who to turn to for help in potentially dangerous situations. Host community conversations with parent-teacher associations, law enforcement, schools, and community members regarding safeguarding children in your community. For the youth, learn how to recognize traffickers' recruitment tactics, how to safely navigate out of a suspicious or uncomfortable situation, and how to reach out for help at any time. Faith-based communities. Host awareness events and community forums with anti-trafficking leaders or collectively support a local victim service provider. Businesses provide jobs, internships, skills training, and other opportunities to trafficking survivors. You know, nobody does. They consider them criminals with a criminal record, and they will not hire a child, teen, or adult who's been trafficked. They don't trust them. They're afraid. Works the same way when people get out of jail in this country. Same thing. They won't touch them. They won't hire them. Or if they do, it's dishwashing or mopping the floor or taking out the garbage. But they won't hire them for anything else. So you think about that. Your 14, 15-year-old son or daughter was human hijacked, that you got them back 2 or 3 later. They've turned themselves around. They go to therapy. They put themselves back through school, and nobody will hire them. Think about it. Take steps to investigate and prevent trafficking in your supply chains by consulting the responsible sourcing to and supply chain to develop effective management systems to detect, prevent, and combat human trafficking. College students, take action on your campus. Join or establish a university club to raise awareness about human trafficking and initiate action throughout your local community. Consider doing one of your research papers on a topic concerning human trafficking. Request that human trafficking be included in university curriculum. Yeah, it's the basket weaving. Yeah, I think that's better than basket weaving. Healthcare providers, learn how to identify the indicators of human trafficking and assist victims. With assistance from local and anti-trafficking organizations, extend low-cost or free activities to human trafficking victims. Resources from the Department of Health and Human Services can be found on their website. Journalists, the media plays an enormous role in shaping perceptions and guiding the public conversation about human trafficking. Seek out some media best practices on how to effectively and responsibly report stories on human trafficking. And the last one is dedicated to attorneys. Offer human trafficking victims legal services, including support for those seeking benefits or special immigration status. Resources are available for attorneys representing victims of human trafficking. That concludes my 20 tips. And I hope you have paid attention, maybe jot down some notes, and think about humanity is one big circle. We all belong on and in that circle. And yes, we are our brother's keeper. Betsy?
Hi. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Thank you, Lillian. Those are great tips. And thank you, Lisa, for your information. I did some research, and I'll tell you what, folks, I'm blown away again. I don't have a computer printer, so I can't print it out, and I can't read my own handwriting, so I'm going to go by my memory. And I also will have a link which will be in the blog. Lisa touched on what life was like for the slaves on the after they were so-called freed. So I won't go into too much about that, but I will say that, you know, I also had read that they had contracts to work. A lot of the older slaves, excuse me, were too feeble and ill sometimes to go off the land and live on their own, so they stayed. A lot of the plantation owners, slave owners, didn't want to tell their slaves that they were freed. They wanted to keep them as slaves. When they were forced to tell them they were free, they did offer them sometimes contracts, as Lisa said, jobs, but life was not good. And a lot of the slaves did join the Union Army. Also, this is really interesting. This is what really blew me away. Abraham Lincoln, as we all know, wrote the Emancipation Proclamation. But did you know that Abraham Lincoln was not keen on the African American slaves mixing in white society? And actually, he attempted to move the slaves over to Haiti and the Caribbean. They also went to parts of Texas, but they were, I read the story, they were sold a bill of goods. If they went on this trip over to this island, they would have jobs, they would have homes, they would have medical care. Well, guess what, folks? They went and there was nothing there. And they were eventually rescued, but not after a lot of unfortunate circumstances happened. Dying, they were poor. So again, they were not treated properly. I did not know that about Abraham Lincoln. Something he will not be taught in school. Excuse me.
You wanted to
So,
send them back to Africa.
yeah, he tried. It's really a sad commentary. And then let's not forget Juneteenth, where the slaves in Texas didn't know until 2 years after that they were freed. And it just sends chills down my spine. And at least to talk about the Ku Klux Klan. I lived down south for 3 years, and I was petrified because I'm Jewish and they don't like Jews.
They don't like Jews either. We're right up there with the blacks and dogs.
So, I guess according to Ku Klux Klan, I'm not Caucasian. It's really scary, but I do want to say that during the civil rights, just popped into my head, the Jews really helped the African Americans. They marched with them and they were involved. And if you saw the movie Mississippi Burning, there were 3 young men who were killed for helping the African Americans to vote. And a lot of stuff, goes on. I watched a movie about Emmett Till, who was a young teenage African American boy who was taken from his home, tortured, beaten, because a white woman accused him of whistling at her. And of course, the jury said these people were not guilty of those crimes. Very unfortunate. I interviewed someone last year, Ray Scott. He was the first African American to win the NBA Coach of the Year in 1974. He was right there at the civil rights. I talked to him about that in my interview with him. He did meet Martin Luther King, Dr. Martin Luther King. And here was this, these basketball players, and they weren't allowed to be in the same hotels, drink from the same water fountain as whites. And as far as the entertainment industry, Sammy Davis Jr., a lot of famous African-American entertainers were discriminated against. But Frank Sinatra, who was, they were in that Rat Pack, if they didn't allow Sammy Davis to go into the hotel or stay there, he said he's not doing it either. So, of course, they respected Frank Sinatra tremendously. And also, interracial dating was frowned upon. Sammy Davis Jr. received death threats for dating white women. It was not accepted at all. And I also want to talk about safety issues again. I did see a program. I never would have thought of this. Did you know that these whack jobs are tagging cars either with white plastic things? I was talking to a young girl last week in a store, excuse me, and they are also tagging your car, putting sunglasses in your outside the doorknob. Who would have thought? She said, if they see a young woman alone, they will tag the car. That's a scary thought. And this young woman told me in an area not too far from me, a few towns over, that this area, which is a high traffic area, is known for human sex trafficking, is known for it, of being approached. Scary. This is scary stuff. Also, when you, this is why I said last week, and I'll keep saying it, you have to be alert, folks, especially as a woman. You have to be alert. I know you like to have the earbuds in your ear, looking at your phone, but the predators look for that. Be alert going to your car. I can't impress that enough. It is very, very important. If you should see one of these tags, call the police and tell them. If you've been approached, you need to tell the police. And Lillian gave excellent, excellent tips. We need to get involved. We need to learn how to protect ourselves and our youth. Which reminds me, I know I talked about I did an interview with a ex-human, a sex trafficker. I'm going to put the book again in the blog because it's a very important book that will help somebody know what kind of mind games these people play with their victims. There's another safety tip, but it just went out of my head. We need to teach our children to be safe. I know, which I said last week, not to go with strangers, even in someone's house. I know last week I talked about Megan's Law, and I just remembered I still love to watch IDTV. Another young girl was raped and murdered by her neighbor. He raped her, handcuffed her, took her down to a whether it was a river or a lake, and made her walk in that water, and she drowned. That's why I told my kids in the preschool, you must ask permission of an adult before you go into even your neighbor's house or apartment. You have to ask permission because, you know, it's not the 60s anymore, folks. We used to go in and out of each other's houses, doors open. You weren't afraid. You know, I was 9 years old taking care of my 3-year-old brother. We went up and down the streets trick-or-treating. There wasn't this fear of strangers. When Josh was old enough to go trick-or-treating, yeah, of course I went with him. And Josh, someone opened their door, he would walk right in. I go, no, Josh, you can't go in someone's house. But this is really important information. And I really want to tell the audience, don't think it can't happen to your loved one, to you, or in your backyard. I just heard on the news yesterday, a woman escaped. She was held prisoner in someone's house. He had like a soundproof room, and she somehow got out. And these stories, like you hear them and think, no, that's not in my neighborhood. Yes, it is in your neighborhood, and it very well can be in your neighborhood. Sex trafficking is all over. I know every day, and I still don't know how they got my email address, of perverts selling themselves. And don't think that the politicians don't know about it. They do. They probably involve themselves. Look at Epstein Island and all the people that went over there. It's really, it's real, folks. We're not making this up. It's real. It happens, and it has to stop. And this inhumanity to each other has to stop. Yes, I'm a product of the 60s and 70s. We have to learn to get along with each other. We have to learn, as Lillian said, we're our brother's keeper. We have to look out for each other and just take care of each other and not hate each other and kill each other. And for what? You know, folks, I say this a lot. You could cut your skin, and what do we all bleed is red blood. There's no difference. Let's start learning to celebrate our differences and to learn to get along with each other. You don't have to agree with someone's lifestyle, religion, like how they dress or whatever. Just don't bother them. Let people live in peace. I went to a hairstylist. He's still getting bullied in this century because he's a homosexual. Why? Why do you have to bother someone? You don't have to. They're your neighbor. Let them live in peace. They're not bothering you. Do your thing. Let someone else do their thing, whether you like it or not. We're not asking you to accept anyone's lifestyle. You don't have to. We do not, and we should not accept human trafficking. That's the lifestyle we shouldn't accept. And we need to put a stop to it. And thank you. That's what I have to say. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for listening to Passionate World Network. And like I always say, we will give you our email so that if you want, you can drop us a line. My email is pwrnetworkllc@gmail.com. Lisa?
Yeah, mine is dementiawhisperer1@gmail.com. Thanks again for being here.
Betsy?
Sloan, SLOAN, Betsy, BETSY31@gmail.com.
Before we close out the program, I do have 2 calls to action, or maybe an announcement. In October, mid-October, our host, Lisa Skinner, is presenting the first of a series of webinars helping caregivers take care of or work with their spouses, loved ones, you name it, who have Alzheimer's. So please, she'll be sending out an email with instructions. Take a good look at it. And if you feel like this is something, even if your husband doesn't have Alzheimer's yet, chances are somebody in your family will have it, because it's outstripped cancer now as the #1 disease, not just in the United States, but in the world. And by learning what you will learn with Lisa, it will make all the difference, because Alzheimer is just not a disease of one. It is a disease for the many caregivers, family members, friends who are going to be associating with that person. So it's important that you sign up for this first course. The second announcement is that we have a Facebook page, facebook.com, lest-we-forget-hysterical. I always want to say hysterical, but I mean historical. Please go over to the page. A lot of what we do on this show is shown there all over again on YouTube, but also on the Facebook page. This is a place where you can come in and ask questions, engage in conversation with Betsy, Lisa, or I, Lillian, and even make suggestions. And if you believe that we should do and take a step further and do something, please suggest it and then become a part of whatever you suggest. Because I know that ones don't work out, but many achieve a lot. So thank you all very much for joining us this afternoon. Remember, next Friday, we're bringing in a special guest talking about the alternative to regular education and why he believes that special schools are needed to teach our young education, since the present school system, and I need to agree with him on this, is broken. Absolutely, and it doesn't prepare anybody for anything from what I can see. When a grandmother can say to me, I was astounded when my grandson held up a piece of paper and there was cursive writing on it. And she says, I thought they decided not to teach you. And the kid says, oh, but grandma, she said, how else are we going to sign our last will and testament? So I guess that's still pretty important these days, at least for last wills and testaments. And coming out of a mouth of a 7-year-old must have been very impressive. So please join us next Friday. Thank you once again, and have a great weekend.